Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome back to Discover Your Dreams. This space is rooted in the grounded life philosophy where inner peace becomes the foundation for purposeful living. Here, we focus on regulation, awareness, and conscious self-leadership as a way of returning to ourselves and meeting life from a grounded place. Before we begin today, take one deep, slow breath and exhale fully. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Just notice your body, the weight of it, the way it's being held, the way it's already supporting you without you having to try. Because today we're talking about something that can quietly change everything. Why your life starts to feel easier when you stop resisting yourself. Not because your life suddenly becomes perfect, not because every challenge disappears, but because you're no longer creating friction from the inside. There's a kind of ease that comes not from controlling your world, but from releasing the constant tug of war within you. The moment you stop fighting your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own pace, your own needs, you free up an enormous amount of energy. Energy you didn't even realize was being drained by the effort of holding yourself in a shape that wasn't yours. When you stop resisting yourself, you stop living in opposition to your own nature. You stop treating your emotions like enemies. You stop treating your needs like inconveniences. You stop treating your imperfections like emergencies. And something subtle but powerful happens. You begin to move through the world with less tension, less second guessing, less self-interruption. You begin to trust yourself. You begin to hear yourself. You begin to work with yourself instead of against yourself. And that's when life starts to feel lighter. Not perfect, just more aligned, more honest, more yours. Most people think life feels hard because of external circumstances, responsibilities, decisions, other people, uncertainty. And yes, those things can be heavy. They can stretch you, overwhelm you, demand more than you feel you have. But often, the real weight isn't what's happening around you. It's the tension of pushing against what you already feel. It's the quiet, constant effort of pretending you're okay when you're not. Of forcing yourself to be positive when something inside you is asking to be heard. Of trying to outrun emotions that only want acknowledgement. Of holding yourself to standards that don't match the season you're in. It's the inner bracing, the tightening, the suppressing, the I shouldn't feel this, the I don't have time for this, the I'll deal with it later. That internal resistance creates a kind of pressure that no external situation can match. Because you're not just carrying life, you're carrying the fight against your own experience of life. And that's what exhausts you. Not the feeling itself, but the effort of pushing it away. When you stop resisting what you feel, even for a moment, something shifts. The heaviness doesn't necessarily vanish, but it stops multiplying. It stops tightening. It stops turning into a battle. You begin to realize that emotions aren't obstacles. They're signals. They're information. They're part of your humanity, not a threat to it. And when you stop pushing against yourself, life doesn't magically become easy, but it becomes less internally conflicted, less draining, less like you're swimming upstream inside your own mind. That's the difference between carrying life and fighting yourself while carrying life. Self-resistance doesn't always announce itself in obvious ways. It often shows up quietly, in the subtle moments when you ignore your instincts because you're afraid of what they might ask of you. It appears when you talk to yourself out of what feels right, convincing yourself that your clarity is somehow unreasonable or inconvenient. It's there when you force yourself to keep going even though something inside you is signaling that something is off. And it lingers when you stay in situations longer than you know is healthy for you, simply because leaving feels uncomfortable or uncertain. Over time, all of these small acts of turning away from yourself create friction. Not in your environment, and not because of the people around you, but within you. It's the internal rubbing, your truth pressing against your choices, your needs pressing against your habits, your intuition pressing against your fear. That inner friction is what wears you down. It's what makes life feel heavier than it needs to be. And it's what begins to shift the moment you stop resisting yourself. There was a time in my life when I kept trying to convince myself that something was right, even though it didn't feel right. I had all the logical reasons lined up in a neat row. It made sense on paper. It looked stable from the outside. It matched the version of life I thought I was supposed to be building. It aligned with the expectations I believed I should be meeting. But internally, something wasn't matching. There was a resistance I couldn't explain away, a quiet pull in the opposite direction, subtle but persistent. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was more like a soft tightening in my chest, a small voice that kept whispering, "This isn't it." I kept trying to override it with logic, with plans, with the comfort of predictability. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself I was being mature. I even told myself that discomfort was normal and that I just needed to push through it. But the truth was, my body and my intuition had already registered the mismatch long before my mind was willing to admit it. And the more I tried to force myself into what looked right, the heavier that quiet pull became. It took me a long time to understand that the resistance wasn't a flaw or a sign of weakness. It was guidance. It was honesty. It was the part of me that still knew the truth, even when I was trying not to see it. Instead of listening, I argued with myself. I kept repeating the same familiar lines in my head. "It's fine. Just keep going. You're overthinking," as if saying them enough times would make them true. I tried to talk myself out of what I was feeling, convincing myself that discomfort was just a sign of weakness or impatience. I treated my intuition like an inconvenience, something to be managed rather than something to be understood. But the more I pushed, the heavier everything became. It wasn't just the situation that felt burdensome. It was my energy. My clarity began to slip. My motivation slowly faded. Even the smallest tasks started to feel harder than they should have been, as if I was moving through my days with an invisible weight strapped to my chest. That heaviness wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from the effort of constantly overriding myself, of insisting I was okay when I wasn't, of forcing myself forward when something inside me was quietly asking me to pause. And the more I ignored that inner voice, the louder the heaviness became. What I eventually came to understand was this. I wasn't struggling because life itself was unbearably hard. The challenges around me weren't the true source of my exhaustion. I was struggling because I was resisting myself at every turn, ignoring what I felt, dismissing what I knew, and pushing against my own inner truth. That resistance was what drained me. It was the constant internal tension, the quiet battle between what I sensed and what I allowed myself to acknowledge. And once I saw that clearly, it became impossible to unsee. The exhaustion wasn't coming from the world. It was coming from the effort of fighting myself. Recognizing that changed everything. The shift didn't come from a big, dramatic change. It didn't require a sudden leap or a bold decision. It began with something much quieter: honesty. It started the moment I allowed myself to admit, this doesn't feel right, without immediately trying to justify it, fix it, or talk myself out of it. Letting that truth exist, even for a moment, felt like opening a window in a room I didn't realize had gone stale. I didn't have to take action right away. I didn't have to know what came next. I just had to stop pretending I didn't feel what I felt. That small moment of alignment, simply telling myself the truth, lifted more weight than anything else I had tried. It was like releasing a breath I'd been holding for far too long, And in that release, I felt the first hint of clarity, the first sense of ease, the first sign that I could trust myself again. When you resist yourself, you end up splitting your energy without even realizing it. One part of you is trying to move forward, doing what you think you're supposed to do, pushing ahead because it seems like the right thing. But another part of you is quietly pulling back, signaling that something doesn't feel aligned, that something inside you needs attention or a different direction. That internal conflict takes an enormous amount of effort to maintain. It's like trying to walk while pulling against your own hand. Every step requires twice the energy. You're not just navigating life, you're managing the tension between your truth and your actions. Over time, that effort turns into exhaustion. Not because you're weak or incapable, but because no one can move smoothly while fighting themselves. The fatigue comes from the friction within, from the constant strain of being divided against your own inner knowing. And the moment you stop resisting yourself, that exhaustion begins to ease. I paused long enough to actually listen. I slowed down. I let myself breathe. I gave myself space to feel what was happening inside me without rushing to label it or push it away. And instead of forcing a decision or trying to control the outcome, I allowed clarity to come in its own time. It was a small shift, almost unnoticeable from the outside, but internally it changed everything. By listening instead of resisting, I created room for truth to surface, gently, naturally, without pressure. Nothing around me changed right away. The circumstances were the same, the decisions still waiting, the uncertainty still present. But internally, something softened. It was subtle, almost quiet, but unmistakable. My body began to relax in a way it hadn't in a long time. The tension I'd been carrying without noticing finally loosened. My thinking became clearer, as if a fog I didn't realize was there had started to lift. My energy slowly returned, not in a dramatic surge, but in a steady, natural way, like coming back to myself. And when I finally made a decision, it didn't feel forced or pressured. It didn't feel like something I had to wrestle myself into. It felt obvious, almost effortless, as if the answer had been waiting for me the whole time. I just needed enough honesty and space to hear it. Ease doesn't come from having a life free of challenges. It doesn't come from everything going your way or from circumstances lining up perfectly. Ease comes from the absence of internal conflict about what you're doing. It comes from moving in a direction that matches what you feel, what you know, and what you're ready for. You can walk through something difficult and still feel aligned. You can face uncertainty, make hard choices, or navigate change and still feel a sense of steadiness inside. Alignment doesn't remove the challenge. It simply removes the inner resistance that makes the challenge heavier. You cannot feel at ease while you're resisting yourself. When your actions and your inner truth are pulling in opposite directions, even simple things feel complicated. The tension builds, the effort increases, and the path becomes harder than it needs to be. Ease begins the moment you stop fighting your own knowing. Let me ask you something. Do things feel hard right now because of what you're doing, or because of how you feel about what you're doing? Take a moment with that. Let it land. Sometimes the difficulty isn't in the task itself, but in the tension between your actions and your inner truth. If you're open to it, you can share one word in the comments: aligned or resisting. No explanation needed, no story required. Just a simple check-in with yourself. Even noticing where you are is powerful. Awareness is the first step toward ease. From a nervous system standpoint, resistance naturally creates tension. That tension keeps your system activated, as if it's on alert, even when nothing urgent is happening. And when your system is activated like that, it tends to overthink. It reacts more intensely than the situation requires, and it struggles to access clarity because everything inside feels slightly on edge. When you stop resisting yourself, your system begins to settle. Your body shifts out of that heightened state. Your mind becomes more spacious, and your emotional responses soften. From that settled place, everything becomes easier to navigate, not because the circumstances change, but because you're no longer fighting an internal battle while trying to move through them. Let's try something simple for a moment. Bring to mind an area of your life that feels heavy right now, something that's been sitting in the background, weighing on you more than you'd like to admit. Don't analyze it, just let it come to the surface. Now ask yourself 3 questions slowly, with curiosity rather than pressure. First, what do I already know about this situation? Not what you wish were true, not what you're trying to convince yourself of, just what you quietly, honestly know. Second, where am I not allowing that to be true? Notice the places where you're pushing it away, minimizing it, or talking yourself out of your own clarity. And third, what would it feel like to stop arguing with myself about this? Not what you would do, not what decision you'd make, simply what would it feel like inside your body if you stopped resisting your own knowing? There's no need to rush the answers. Just notice what rises. Sometimes awareness alone creates the first shift. When you stop resisting yourself, something shifts in a very real way. Your energy begins to come back online, almost like part of you that had been dimmed finally has room to breathe again. Your decisions become clearer because you're no longer trying to see through a fog of internal conflict. And your actions become more effective, not because you're trying harder, but because you're finally moving in a direction that matches what you feel and know. This doesn't happen because life suddenly becomes easy or because all of your challenges disappear. It happens because you're no longer working against yourself. The moment your inner world aligns with your outer actions, everything becomes more fluid, more grounded, and more manageable. Alignment creates its own kind of ease. You don't need to make every decision perfectly. Perfection isn't what brings peace. What matters far more is learning to stop fighting what you already feel. Your body is constantly giving you information, quiet signals, subtle shifts, small nudges that often speak before your mind has caught up. Those sensations aren't random, they're guidance. Alignment begins the moment you trust those signals, even a little. When you allow your inner knowing to matter, when you stop dismissing what your body is trying to tell you, something inside you settles. Decisions become clearer, not because you've analyzed every angle, but because you're finally listening to the part of you that already knows the truth. Life doesn't have to feel this heavy, not because everything suddenly becomes easy or because challenges disappear, but because you stop creating unnecessary friction inside yourself. So much of the weight we carry comes from the tension between what we know and what we allow ourselves to act on. You don't have to push against yourself to move forward. In fact, the moment you stop fighting your own truth, the path in front of you becomes noticeably lighter. When you stop resisting what's real for you, what you feel, what you sense, what you quietly know, life becomes easier to walk through. Not effortless, but clearer. Not perfect, but far less draining. Alignment doesn't remove difficulty, but it removes the struggle within the difficulty. And that changes everything. I'll see you next time.